It was a night that could only be described as an unsettling dance between uncertainty and dread. A night that forever changed the delicate fabric of my marriage. I hadn't anticipated that something as innocent as a dinner invitation from my mother would unravel the threads of trust I had painstakingly woven with my wife. The evening had started with a soft whisper of normalcy. The scent of roast chicken and freshly cut herbs filled the air as my wife, Lydia, and I shared a quiet dinner in our cozy home. Her laughter, light and melodic, was always the soothing sound that eased my mind after a long day. Her eyes, those dark pools of warmth, flickered with excitement as we made plans for the upcoming weekend. Yet, as the clock neared 7 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Dinner tomorrow night. Just the three of us. You know how important it is to me that we keep this family together. Let me know what time works." I read it once, twice, trying to grasp its meaning, feeling the unease gather in my chest like storm clouds. I hadn't been close to my mother in years. Her controlling nature often suffocated me, and our relationship had grown distant over time. But the words on the screen were a stark invitation, a reminder of her presence in my life that I couldn't simply ignore. The next evening, Lydia and I sat at the dinner table, the tension between us palpable, and I could see the subtle shift in her posture. She was no longer fully present, her thoughts drifting into an unspoken place. My mother's presence always had that effect. Something in her seemed to pull at the delicate threads of our bond. "Mom's insisting we meet tonight, huh?" Lydia asked, her voice soft, tracing the edge of her wineglass with her finger. "Yeah, I know," I replied, my words slower than usual, a strange weight pressing down on my chest. "She says it's important." The minute we stepped into my mother's home, the air shifted. It was as though the walls were cloaked in an invisible fog of judgment, each piece of furniture positioned to remind me of the control she once held over me. Her eyes met mine as we entered, sharp and calculating, always measuring, always assessing. "You've arrived," my mother said, her voice smooth, a practiced tone that carried the authority she'd held over me for as long as I could remember. She was seated at the head of the table, as though commanding the room, her posture straight and unyielding. "Of course," Lydia murmured, her polite smile failing to hide the tension creeping into her voice. She was used to my mother's power plays, but that didn't make them any easier to endure. We exchanged pleasantries, the polite hum of conversation, masking the discomfort that sat heavily between us. It was when the meal was nearly finished that the true nature of the evening began to surface. "You know, Lydia," my mother said, her voice low and almost conspiratorial, "I've been thinking about you lately, about your relationship with my son." Lydia's hand faltered midair as she reached for her wine glass. "What about it?" I watched my mother closely, sensing the coldness in her words, the calculated delivery, but Lydia didn't seem to catch it. She was still smiling, her warmth attempting to fill the space. "Well," my mother began, her tone casual, as though the words she was about to speak were of no real consequence. "I've always believed that a woman should have options. Options in everything, but especially in her marriage. It's the only way to stay happy, wouldn't you agree?" My stomach churned. I could feel the words hovering, like venom ready to poison the air between us. Lydia's face remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of discomfort cross her features. "I don't understand," she said, her voice guarded. My mother leaned forward, eyes glinting in the dim light. "I mean, if you ever feel unsatisfied, or if you need something more than your husband can offer, well, there's no harm in exploring other avenues. A little freedom, if you will." The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I could barely register the words, let alone the implications of what she was suggesting. Lydia's gaze flicked between my mother and me, confusion and something else, something darker, creeping into her eyes. She shifted uncomfortably, the words not fully processing, but I could see the question forming. Was she truly hearing what I thought she was hearing? I wanted to speak, to say something, to tell my mother to stop, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about her, something that commanded silence, that forced compliance. I could feel the weight of my history with her pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to even breathe, let alone challenge her. This is a nightmare, I thought. How could she say such a thing? How could she? Lydia, please, I said, my voice trembling. I didn't know she would. The sound of Lydia's footsteps faded into the distance, and the room seemed to constrict around me. My mother's voice, though still smooth and calculated, felt like an insidious weight pressing down on my chest. My breath came in shallow, bursts as I tried to process what had just transpired, but the pieces wouldn't fit together. I had always known my mother was controlling, manipulative even, but this felt like something far darker, something far more deliberate. I remained frozen in my seat, the air thick with her presence, as though she were studying me, waiting for my response. I could almost hear the quiet triumph in her eyes, the gleam of satisfaction that danced at the edge of her words. She had planted the seed, and now it was growing, twisting in my mind like an unstoppable vine. "You're thinking too much about this," my mother said, her tone far too calm, as though this were a simple discussion, an innocent remark. I couldn't respond immediately. I felt the words locked behind a wall, a barricade of anger and disbelief that I couldn't breach. Instead, I leaned forward, my knuckles gripping the edge of the table, my whole body trembling with the need to make sense of what had just been suggested. I don't know what to say, Mom," I finally managed to say, the words slipping out hoarsely, almost inaudible. She tilted her head slightly as though she were inspecting me, searching for a reaction. Her smile never faltered. "You don't have to say anything, darling," she replied softly. "I know you better than anyone. You want to make your marriage work, but you're too caught up in old ideas about love and loyalty. Don't you? See? Love is about freedom. It's about being happy, about finding fulfillment wherever you can." The bile in my throat rose, and I swallowed hard, trying to push it down. "No, that's not how it works," I said, my voice suddenly stronger, though still laced with confusion and disbelief. "That's not love. You can't just throw away everything because you're unhappy. It's not that simple." "Oh, but it is," she countered smoothly, her eyes narrowing in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. "Why cling to a single person when there are so many options out there? You're young, your wife is young, and if things are lacking between you two, it's not your fault. You need to be free to explore. Everyone does." I shook my head, my pulse quickening as the anger began to bubble up, hot and raw. This wasn't just a suggestion. This was manipulation, pure and simple. "You don't get it," I said, my voice rising without me realizing it. "You don't know Lydia. She's not like that. We don't need anyone else. We just need each other. I love her, and I don't want anyone messing with that." But my mother wasn't listening. Her eyes were already calculating, moving beyond me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she had long since made up her mind about what was best. My words meant nothing to her, because in her world, control was everything. The silence that followed felt suffocating, the space between us growing colder with each passing second. I could feel the weight of her expectations pressing against me, the suffocating pressure of her gaze. I had always tried to appease her, tried to make her proud, but this was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening behind me snapped me out of my spiraling thoughts. I turned quickly, desperate to see Lydia, to explain myself, to make her understand that I had nothing to do with this. But when my gaze met hers, I knew that the damage had already been done. She stood at the threshold, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of hurt, confusion, and something deeper. Something I couldn't quite place. She hadn't said a word when she entered, hadn't made a sound as she stood there. But the weight of her presence was enough to make my heart clench in my chest. Lydia's eyes flicked between me and my mother, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she were fighting to hold herself together. I need to go, she said softly, her voice trembling just slightly as she spoke. I can't. Be here right now. The words hit me like a physical blow, the force of them knocking the breath from my lungs. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was watch helplessly as Lydia turned on her heel, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the house as she walked away, leaving me with the hollow ache of regret in the pit of my stomach. My mother's gaze followed Lydia, her expression unreadable. Then, without any change in her demeanor, she looked back at me, her voice calm, almost detached. You see? This is what happens when you try to hold on too tightly. It's a mistake to think you can control another person, to think you can own them. You've always been too weak, too attached, and now look what's happened. I couldn't hear her anymore. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face as I stepped outside, the streets dimly lit under the haze of street lamps. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the frantic rush of thoughts in my mind. What did I just witness? What had she just said? My mother's words were still ringing in my ears like an incessant drumbeat, drowning out my ability to think clearly. But it wasn't the words themselves. It was the realization that she had orchestrated this moment, that, in some twisted way, she had been setting the stage for this kind of rupture all along. I had always known that she had a penchant for control, for manipulation, but I never imagined she would go this far, that she would try to dismantle the most sacred relationship of my life. Lydia. I didn't even know where to look for her. She had stormed out so suddenly, the door slamming behind her echoing in my mind like a final punctuation mark. I can't lose her. Not like this. I ran down the street, the cool night air doing little to calm the fire that had ignited inside me. My feet hit the pavement with an almost frantic energy, driven by panic, by desperation. I reached for my phone, dialing Lydia's number without a second thought, but it went straight to voicemail. Lydia, I said, my voice trembling as I spoke into the phone. Please pick up. I don't know what just happened back there, but I need to talk to you. I need to explain. Please come back. I ended the call and tried, again dialing once more, but the same empty, unforgiving tone greeted me. It wasn't until I reached the park that I saw her, standing near the edge of the pond, her back to me, her shoulders hunched in a way that made my stomach twist. She was there, but she wasn't there. Her presence was a ghost, distant, unreachable. The moonlight cast a soft glow on her, making her seem ethereal, almost otherworldly, but her posture spoke volumes. She wasn't waiting for me to approach. She was standing there, alone in her thoughts, caught in the quiet devastation of what had transpired. I hesitated, unsure of how to approach her, afraid that every step I took might push her further away. But then I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to cross the distance between us. Each footfall was heavy with guilt, each breath shallow with uncertainty. When I was close enough, I stopped, just out of reach, allowing the space between us to shrink without forcing it. Lydia, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what else to say. How could I? The weight of the moment hung between us, like an insurmountable chasm. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that could only come from an emotional battle. Her gaze flickered to mine, but it didn't linger. There was a distance in her eyes that I couldn't quite reach. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice flat, like a door closing in my face. "You should be with her. With your mother." The words stung, a bitter wound that went deeper than I had anticipated. She was angry, but more than that, she was hurt. She felt betrayed, and that hurt was something I had no idea how to fix. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping closer, though she still didn't move. Lydia, you don't understand. She twisted everything. She put that idea in your head, but I never would. I never want anyone else. It's just her. She's trying to control everything, and I stopped, my words suddenly failing me. What could I say? How could I explain that my mother's influence was like a dark cloud hanging over my life, clouding every decision, every relationship? She shook her head slowly, a small, sad smile crossing her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know. What I heard, what she said." Her voice cracked just slightly, but she quickly masked it. "And you didn't say anything to stop her. You didn't even try. You let her suggest it. You let her poison everything." I took another step, forward, reaching out instinctively, but she flinched, taking a half step back. The rejection hit me like a cold wave, but I didn't pull back. I couldn't. "I wasn't prepared for that, Lydia," I said, my voice raw with emotion. "I didn't know she was going to say those things. You don't understand. She's always tried to manipulate me, but this is different. I'm not her. I don't think like her, and I don't want anyone else but you." Her eyes flickered with something akin to hope, but it was quickly followed by the shadow of doubt. She closed her eyes, taking a long, slow breath, her hands tightening at her sides. "I want to believe you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But you have to understand. When someone you trust tells you that something is wrong with your marriage, when they suggest that maybe you're missing something, it makes you wonder. It makes you doubt. And now, all I can think about is, what if she's right? What if I am not enough?" The following days unfolded like a nightmare on repeat, each moment heavier than the last. It wasn't just the distance between Lydia and me, though that was a wound that would take time to heal. It was the insidious realization that the bond between us had been tainted by my own mother's betrayal. The seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried to convince Lydia that I was not like her, that I was not like her, my mother's shadow loomed too large to ignore. I couldn't just sit back and let this fester. I couldn't let my mother's manipulation define our future. The idea of revenge for the betrayal that had poisoned our lives, it began to form in the deepest, darkest corners of my mind. The anger, though slow at first, grew into something far more dangerous. It simmered beneath the surface, taking root in the place where my sense of justice once stood. She needed to pay. She had crossed a line. What she had done was unforgivable, and no amount of words would undo the damage. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I thought about her face. The way she had smiled as she suggested something so vile, her unblinking confidence that she could manipulate me, that she could use me as a pawn in her own twisted game. My mother had always controlled the narrative of my life, from the smallest details to the largest choices. But this was something different. This was an assault on my marriage, on the woman I loved, and that I would not stand for. I couldn't let it go, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to anymore. I wasn't sure if I even could. The plan started taking shape in the silence of the night, when I was alone with my thoughts and the weight of betrayal. There was a quiet darkness that whispered to me in those hours, urging me towards something I couldn't quite name. But what I did know was this: I wasn't going to let my mother continue to run my life. I wasn't going to let her tear apart what I had worked so hard to build with Lydia. The next few days were a blur. I knew I couldn't confront my mother immediately. She was too sharp, too calculating. Any move I made too soon would give her the upper hand, and she would turn it against me. No, I needed to wait for the right moment. I needed to make my actions deliberate, untraceable, and above all, I needed to make sure that when the time came, my revenge would hit her in the one place that would make her feel every ounce of the pain she had caused me. The more I thought about it, the clearer the path became. I began to gather information, every vulnerable detail I could find, every crack in my mother's pristine facade. It wasn't long before I discovered that she had been hiding her own secrets, relationships with people who could threaten her reputation if the right things were exposed. She had used these connections to control situations, manipulate those around her, but what if the tables were turned? What if I exposed her for the world to see, for the people who looked up to her and admired her to see the woman she truly was? It was the perfect way to destroy her, to ruin the image she had spent years carefully constructing. It wasn't just about causing pain, it was about showing her once and for all that no one was invincible, not even her. But then there was Lydia. In my desire for retribution, I couldn't ignore the woman standing beside me, trying to heal the wounds my mother had so callously inflicted. If I went down this path, would I lose her again? Would my thirst for revenge cloud my judgment to the point where I hurt her too? The last thing I wanted was to drive Lydia further away. But if I didn't take action, if I let my mother get away with this, I knew the resentment would eat at me from the inside out, slowly suffocating everything I loved. I met Lydia that evening at the same park where we had tried to salvage what remained of our trust. She was sitting on the same bench, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze distant. She looked so fragile in that moment, like something that could slip through my fingers if I wasn't careful. I hesitated before sitting beside her, unsure of how to even begin. I hadn't told her everything I was planning, couldn't tell. Her, not yet. I couldn't risk it. But the tension between us was thick, suffocating, and I could feel it in every inch of the space we shared. She turned to look at me, her eyes soft but guarded. "I've been thinking," I said slowly, breaking the silence. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, heavier than usual. "About everything. About what my mom did. And I know I can't fix it with just words." Lydia didn't say anything, but I could see the flicker of concern in her eyes. She knew something was coming, something I wasn't telling her. I just couldn't find the right words to explain the rage that was churning inside me. "I don't know if I can forgive her," I continued, my voice lower now. "I don't know if I can let this go." What she did was unforgivable. The days after my conversation with Lydia had been quiet, unsettling. I knew she was trying to heal, trying to trust again, but the distance between us remained, an invisible wall I couldn't tear down, no matter how hard I tried. Her trust was shattered, and with it, the foundation of our relationship. I could see the cracks in her eyes whenever she looked at me. There was something missing now, a part of her that had been lost in the fallout. But there was more. There was a growing unease, a gnawing feeling that something wasn't adding up. Lydia had changed, but in subtle ways, ways that I couldn't ignore. She had become more distant, more withdrawn. She was still loving in her gestures, still trying to be the woman I had fallen in love with, but there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, that caught my attention. One evening, as I watched her sip her wine, lost in thought, a sickening feeling began to spread in my chest. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at it before quickly picking it up and walking away. It was nothing overt, no loud arguments, or visible signs of anything wrong, but there was a shift in her behavior that didn't feel right. It wasn't the casual distance that I had come to expect after the confrontation with my mother. It was something else, something deeper. Was she hiding something from me? The question haunted me, gnawing at my insides, but I couldn't bring myself to ask her directly. I had already been through so much, accusations from my mother, accusations from Lydia, and I couldn't risk pushing her away even further. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and like a vine it began to grow, twisting through my thoughts and clouding my judgment. I needed answers. I needed to know if I could trust her. It was with this decision that the investigation began. Not with grand gestures, but with the careful, subtle methods that anyone who had been betrayed before would use. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to accuse her without proof, but the signs were mounting. I had to know if she was truly the woman I thought she was. The first step was simple: watching. I paid closer attention to her actions. It wasn't enough to just listen to her words. I needed to see her, to observe how she acted when I wasn't looking. Little things stood out: the way she would glance at her phone and quickly swipe away a notification whenever I was near, the way she had begun working late more often, how she seemed to hurry away from the kitchen when I came in with an unexpected request. There were also the frequent messages she would exchange in whispers when I wasn't in the room, her eyes darting around nervously when I came close. It wasn't concrete proof, but it was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. The suspicion gnawed at me, building with each passing day. What was she hiding? I knew she was hiding something, but what? Was it a secret I couldn't even begin to imagine? Or was it something that, in the end, would break me? Then came the final piece that pushed me over the edge. One evening I followed her. She had said she was going to a friend's house for a few drinks, something casual, nothing out of the ordinary. But this time something was different. She was more evasive, her responses clipped and hurried when I asked for details about her plans. I didn't question her, at least not openly, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. So I followed her. I kept my distance, kept to the shadows, watching her every movement. The night air was cool as I trailed behind her, blending into the crowds of people on the street. She walked with purpose, her steps quick, though there was an odd tension in her movements that felt out of place. She arrived at the restaurant where she had said she would be meeting her friend, but instead of going inside, she stood outside for a moment, checking her phone. And then he appeared. A man. He walked toward her with a smile, and I watched as she greeted him with an embrace that seemed a little too intimate for something as casual as a friend's meeting. They exchanged a few words, and she laughed at something he said, the sound too easy, too natural, as though she had known him for far longer than she had let on. My heart stopped in my chest, the blood draining from my face as I watched them walk together, side by side. They entered the restaurant, but not together. She disappeared into the crowd, and I stayed outside, my pulse racing, my mind reeling. Was this the man who had been texting her? The one she had been so secretive about? I stayed in the shadows for hours, watching, waiting. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter with every minute. What was going on between them? As the night stretched on, I saw them leave together, laughing as they walked toward the parking lot. She didn't glance back at me, didn't seem to notice the weight of my gaze on her. The sun barely peeked through the blinds as I sat in the dim glow of the morning light, the quiet of the house almost suffocating. I had gone through the motions that night, the minutes stretching into hours as I wrestled with the images of Lydia. And the man, the kiss, the laughter, the easy familiarity that should have never existed between them. My mind refused to settle. It churned with questions, each more devastating than the last. I had watched her long enough to confirm what I already suspected. This wasn't some fleeting mistake, some casual interaction. No, this was something deeper. There was a history between them, a connection that went beyond mere friendship. She had lied to me. She had been hiding something for God knows how long, and now the truth had finally been laid bare. But I wasn't satisfied. Not yet. I had seen enough to know that my suspicions weren't unfounded, but there was a part of me that still needed the hard evidence. My heart told me everything I needed to know, but my mind wasn't ready to accept it without the proof that would shatter everything I had once believed. So I waited. She hadn't come home that night, which was unlike her. She had texted, of course, something about staying at a friend's house, one of those throwaway excuses she had used before. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The weight of what I had seen lingered in the back of my mind, making every minute without her feel like an eternity. When she finally returned in the morning, I was already in the kitchen, trying to focus on the mundane task of making coffee, as though nothing had changed, as though I hadn't just watched her betray me, as though the world hadn't shifted beneath my feet. She entered quietly, her footsteps light, but there was an unease in the way she moved. She knew, somewhere deep down, that the calm exterior I presented was a facade. I could feel her gaze on me as she stood in the doorway, watching me, waiting. "Hey," she said, her voice a little too soft, as though she was testing the waters. "You're up early." I didn't look up. I focused on the coffee machine, pretending to measure the grounds with a deliberateness that was all too deliberate. The silence stretched between us, thicker than the scent of coffee. "Yeah," I replied, my voice cold, controlled. "Couldn't sleep." I finally turned to face her, the mug in my hand shaking slightly, but not enough for her to notice. She was standing there, looking at me with that same soft gaze, the one that once made my heart race with affection, now making my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. I'm sorry," she said quietly, stepping into the room with hesitation, as though unsure of how to bridge the gap between us. "I didn't mean to worry you." I didn't respond right away. My eyes drifted down to the phone on the counter, the one she had left charging while she'd been out the night before. It was now sitting innocuously on the granite surface, but the weight of it, its very presence, felt like a heavy anchor in my chest. I needed that phone. I moved quickly, almost instinctively, before I could stop myself. I picked it up, pressing the unlock button before she could protest, before she could say a word. I didn't even care if it was wrong anymore. If the trust between us was already gone, then what did a little more dishonesty matter? The screen blinked to life in my hand, but what I saw on it nearly stopped my heart. There were messages, too. Many messages, texts, photos, and long conversations that had been hidden beneath layers of reassurance and promises. They were from him, the man I had seen her with. His name flashed on the screen like a knife to my gut, a name I hadn't even known existed in her life until the night I had followed her. There were no words of love, no admittance of anything overtly illicit, but the intimacy between them was undeniable. The texts ranged from flirtations to late-night exchanges. In one, he sent a picture of a sunset with the simple words, "Wish you were here." She had responded almost immediately, "Maybe soon." I felt my chest tighten with every line I read. The trust that had taken so long to build, the intimacy I thought we had shared, had been shattered piece by piece behind my back. But it didn't stop there. As I scrolled further, I saw a photo, an intimate photo of her, sent from him. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough. It was a moment of vulnerability, one I had never seen before, one she had shared with him in secret. I felt my hands shake as I put the phone down, the weight of the evidence crashing down on me like a 1,000-pound wave. There was no denying it now. She had betrayed me. She had been living a lie, and I had been blind to it. Lydia, still standing, in the doorway, hadn't moved. She had been watching me the entire time, her expression unreadable, but her eyes wide, wide with realization. She knew I had found it. Did you find what you were looking for? Didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. I was numb, drowning in the weight of it all. The anger, the heartbreak, the betrayal. It all collided inside me, mixing with the unbearable ache that twisted in my chest. She had been lying, and I had known it, but now the proof was there in my hands, as undeniable as the sun rising in the sky. My voice cracked, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I could continue. But I had to. I needed her to hear it. I know what you've been doing, Lydia. I know about him. Her face went pale, and her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. Her eyes flickered from the phone back to my face, a mix of guilt and something darker flashing in her expression. I didn't want to hurt you, she finally whispered, her voice breaking. I never meant for it to get this far. The words were hollow, empty, and I knew they weren't enough. Nothing could be enough to undo what had already been done. I think, I said quietly, my voice cold now. That's all I need to hear. She took a step forward, but I couldn't move. I couldn't let her come any closer, not when everything between us was now poisoned, not when the trust was gone. And in that silence, in the heavy space between us, I made a decision. I had the evidence now. I had the truth. What came next wasn't about the love we had once shared. It was about the fallout, the consequences of betrayal. It was time for the reckoning. The truth had set something in motion inside me, something dark, something primal. It wasn't just hurt that I felt anymore. It was a quiet, seething fury, the kind that came from betrayal at the deepest level. Lydia, my partner, the woman I had shared my life with, had chosen to lie, to deceive, and to hide a world from me that I had never known existed. The sting of that wound had carved itself into my heart, and though the blood had stopped flowing, the scar it left would never heal. It was a wound I could not simply ignore. It demanded a response. It demanded action. I sat in the quiet of the living room after she left, the house empty and still. But my mind raced. How do you even begin to comprehend something like this? The person you trusted the most, the one you believed in, had shattered your world with a few whispered words, with a few hidden actions that painted a picture of betrayal. Now the question lingered in the air like smoke. What would I do with this knowledge? My first instinct was simple. Leave. To walk away. To cut my ties. To erase everything that had ever been. But something inside me told me that wouldn't be enough. She didn't deserve that kind of mercy. No, I wanted something more. Something that would make her understand the depth of what she had done. Something that would make her feel the same crushing weight that had settled in my chest. I would make her pay for what she did. But it wouldn't be recklessness. It wouldn't be a hasty decision born from an emotional outburst. No. I would be patient. I would be methodical. And so I began to plan. The first step was observing. I watched her closely, like a predator studying its prey. I needed to understand her movements, her habits, the small details of her daily life that she no longer thought twice about. She was still trying to act normal, still trying to hold on to the semblance of the life we once shared. But every smile she gave me, every word she spoke, was laced with guilt. It was in her eyes, in the way she shifted when I touched her, in the way she avoided eye contact when I asked her questions. She was already unraveling, but I needed more. I began gathering information. I went through her social media accounts, retracing every step of her interaction with him. The pictures, the comments, the flirty texts, they all painted a picture. One that was far from the picture she had painted for me. I memorized it all. I had to know every detail before I could proceed. Her phone was no longer a sanctuary, and I had access to it whenever I needed. But I didn't want to rush. The more I knew, the more devastating the fallout would be. Then there was him, The man she had betrayed me for. I needed to understand him, to see who he was, to determine just how much damage I wanted to inflict. His name was Mark, and he worked at some high-end marketing firm. A man of status, of charm, the kind of man I could never be. I dug deeper, searching for anything that could be used against him, any chink in his armor. And it didn't take long. Mark had a history. Several relationships, some public, others not so much. It wasn't hard to see that he was the kind of man who liked to play the field, a bit of a ladies' man, but nothing too scandalous on the surface. No, the real treasure was in the details, the cracks in his perfect exterior. His ex-wife, for one, had a long history of public complaints, and there were rumors of infidelity on his part. That would be important later. He was a man with a reputation that could be easily tarnished. I wasn't going to confront him directly. No, I wasn't that reckless. But I could use the information I had gathered. I could leverage it to cause enough damage without lifting a finger. I would turn his own world upside down. That was where the true power lay, taking someone who thought they were untouchable and watching them crumble. Lydia, too, would not be left untouched in this. She was my first target. The woman I had loved, the one who had promised to stay true, was about to experience a different side of me. A side that had been buried, suppressed, until this betrayal had made it rise to the surface. I would make her feel the guilt she had so carefully buried, the guilt that had been gnawing at her every day since the moment I found out. She would see, in the coldest way possible, just how much damage her lies had caused, but I wasn't going to confront her head-on just yet. I was too clever for that. Instead, I decided to keep her in suspense, to make her think she was getting away with it. I would play the role of the patient, broken man, pretending to work through the pain, pretending to heal. She would think I had forgiven her. She would believe that I was willing to move on, to let go. But I wasn't. Not at all. I took note of every detail. I started leaving little things around the house, pieces of evidence that only I knew about. I would make sure that she felt the weight of her guilt every time she came across one of those pieces. Every time she tried to hide from the truth, it would catch up to her. I began sending anonymous messages to Mark's ex-wife, making sure she knew about the affair. I didn't give her every detail, but just enough to ignite a spark of suspicion. A few rumors here and there, enough to make Mark feel the heat of a public scandal. If he thought he was untouchable, he was wrong. I would make sure his world came crashing down, just as mine had. As the days passed, I felt the control slip from Lydia's hands. She began to show cracks in her calm facade, her guilt creeping into her every movement. She couldn't hide from the truth, not forever. Soon, she would feel the sting of her own betrayal. And when she did, she would finally understand the price of playing with someone's heart. The weeks that followed were a strange dance, one of appearances, forced smiles, and thinly veiled tension. I kept up the act, playing the role of the man who had forgiven, who was moving on, while all the while I let the plans I had so carefully set in motion begin to take root. But the truth, like a silent predator, lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Lydia still wore the mask, the one she thought I couldn't see through, and I let her. I let her believe that she was getting away with it. Her phone, which I now had unrestricted access to, buzzed endlessly, but it wasn't the notifications from her friends or work that caught my attention. No, it was the brief, occasional messages from Mark. They were shorter now, their words clipped and less frequent. But the subtext was there. The intimacy between them hadn't dissipated, and I could feel it in the weight of each word. The half-formed sentences that carried the remnants of a secret they were both desperately trying to hide. I had waited for this moment, for the point, where I would no longer need to search for the truth, for where the truth would find me, And it did. It came in the form of an innocuous night, a Thursday, a day much like any other. I had gone out to run a few errands, pretending to have a normal day, pretending like everything was fine. Lydia, as usual, had stayed home. The quiet hum of her movements in the house barely detectable over the sound of the TV. I came back later in the evening, the car pulling into the driveway, the familiar sight of our home seeming colder than usual. The night was dim, the air still with the promise of more rain. But it wasn't the weather that gave me pause, it was the faint sound of voices. I wasn't surprised. She had been acting distant, even more so than usual. But it wasn't just that. It was something in the air, a subtle shift that had begun after I'd first confronted her. It was as if she couldn't shake the feeling, that something was always watching, always lurking. And tonight, I had to admit to myself, I was. The door creaked as I stepped inside, the living room bathed in the flickering blue light of the TV. Lydia was on the couch, curled up with a book in her hands, the sound of the rain outside almost soothing. But her expression was distracted. Her mind elsewhere, her eyes unfocused as she flipped the page with mechanical motions. But then I saw it, the phone. It lay there on the coffee table, face up. And just as my eyes caught the screen, a notification appeared, a text from Mark. The name, as if it had been burned into my mind, seared into my thoughts. But it wasn't just the name that caught me. It was the content. The message was innocent. Enough at first glance, a playful line about the weather, something inconsequential. But it was the next message that struck me, the one that followed just moments later. "I'll be there tomorrow night. Don't tell him. I miss you." I froze, the words hitting me with the force of a slap. "Don't tell him." The words seemed to echo in my mind. They were simple, almost trivial in their innocence. But in that simplicity, they were a death knell to everything I had believed. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, my stomach tightening as the weight of the situation settled in. She hadn't learned. She hadn't changed. The betrayal, it seemed, was not only ongoing, but it was escalating. I could feel the anger rising within me, that hot, raw fury that made my limbs tremble. Again. After everything, after the way I had meticulously planned my revenge, after the way I had made her feel the weight of her actions. She was still doing it. She hadn't stopped. She wasn't sorry. And in that moment, I realized something that made the pit in my stomach deepen. This wasn't just a mistake. This was her choice. I stood there in the doorway, my mind racing, the room suddenly too small. I had to think, had to decide what to do. The storm of emotions was overwhelming, each second stretching into infinity as I weighed my options. But then, as I stood there in that bitter silence, I did something I had never imagined I'd do. I stepped forward, calmly, deliberately, and sat down beside her. She didn't notice at first. Her eyes were glued to the screen of her phone, her fingers moving across it with the ease of someone who had grown comfortable in a lie. It was almost too easy for her now. She didn't even glance up at me. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to speak, had to break the silence that felt suffocating. "You're still talking to him," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. There was no anger in my tone, no heat, just a coldness, a calm that terrified me. "And you're planning on seeing him tomorrow night? How long were you going to keep lying to me, Lydia?" She froze, her hand pausing mid-scroll as the words sank in. The silence between us stretched long after I had spoken, my words settling into the heavy, stagnant air like a thick fog. Lydia's eyes, wide and guilty, flicked between my face and the phone in her trembling hands. I could feel her mind scrambling, the gears of her thoughts grinding in an effort to come up with some sort of excuse, some way to escape the crushing truth I had laid bare. But there was nothing that could save her now. She opened her mouth, her voice breaking through the stillness, but the words she spoke were hollow, desperate. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at her words. She didn't mean to hurt me? She hadn't even tried to stop herself. It wasn't about intention anymore, it was about choice. Every word she said now was just another layer of the web she had spun to conceal her lies, a defense mechanism against the consequences of her actions. "Didn't mean to hurt me?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Then why did you do it again, Lydia? After everything I showed you, after all the lies I uncovered, you still chose him. You still chose this. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. And now you're going to face the consequences." Her eyes flicked away, her lips trembling as though she were on the verge of tears. But I didn't care. Not anymore. "I've been patient," I continued, my voice colder now, more deliberate. "I've given you chances to change, to fix this, to make it right. But you never took them. And now, you've pushed me too far. You wanted to make me a fool? You wanted to shatter everything we had? Well, Lydia, I'm going to return the favor." She looked at me then, her face contorted with the desperate need to explain, to make me understand her side. But there was no side anymore. There was no justification for the betrayal, no excuse to make it okay. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was too late. "You already have," I said softly, my gaze unwavering. "You just don't realize it yet." And with those words, something inside me shifted. The final thread of affection I had for her unraveled. I had spent months trying to figure out what I would do, how I would make her understand, how I could hurt her in a way that would make her feel the weight of her actions, feel it as deeply as I had. But now, the answer was simple. I wasn't going to beg for her to understand. I wasn't going to make her feel the weight of my pain directly. No, that wasn't enough. I would take away the one thing that she cherished most, the trust I had given her. "You're going to leave," I said coldly. "Pack your things. You're not staying here another night." Her eyes flashed with panic, her body trembling as she opened her mouth to protest. But I didn't let her speak. I wasn't interested in hearing her broken apologies or watching her try to pull herself together. The damage had been done. She stood slowly, her face pale, a mix of shock and confusion evident in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. She thought, I would be the one to beg, the one to plead. She was wrong. "I've already called a locksmith," I added, the words slipping out with ease, like the final step in a carefully orchestrated plan. "You'll be gone by morning. I've already taken care of everything." Lydia's breath hitched, and I could see the panic seeping into her expression as her chest rose and fell unevenly. She was about to speak again, but I held up a hand, silencing her. I didn't need to hear more empty words. The sound of her footsteps moving slowly to the stairs echoed in the room, each step like a drumbeat marking the end of everything. She didn't look back at me, didn't try to touch me, didn't say a word. She knew. Deep down, she knew that this was the end. I stayed where I was, the cold weight of the decision pressing down on me like a stone lodged in my chest. I could hear the faint sound of her packing, the rustling of clothes in the suitcase, the hurried movements of someone trying to outrun the consequences of their actions. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the very thing she had done to me, so many months ago when she'd betrayed me. She was running from the truth, running from the life we had built together. And just like her, I wasn't going to chase her. I wasn't going to beg for her to stay. This was her choice, and now she would face it alone. As I stood there, the house feeling emptier with every passing second, I thought of everything I had lost, my trust, my peace, my sense of security. But even more than that, I thought of the person I had become in the aftermath of her betrayal. She had taken something precious from me, and in return I had learned how to stand on my own, how to find power in my pain. I wasn't the broken man she had left behind. I wasn't the fool who had been played. I had found my strength, my resolve, and now it was her turn to feel the consequences of her choices. When she finally walked out the door, suitcase in hand, she didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. She had already made her decision, and she would live with it. As the door clicked shut behind her, I felt a strange sense of release, a momentary stillness that settled over me like the calm after a storm. I had done what I had to do. I had given her everything I could, only to have it thrown away. Now, I would move forward, a different man, stronger, wiser, and ready to take on the future. This chapter was closed, and in that quiet, I finally felt like I had reclaimed my peace. The investigation had begun long before the confrontation, long before I had stood there watching the weight of my wife's betrayal unfold before me. It had started in those quiet moments when suspicion first crept in, when the small cracks in our life together grew too noticeable to ignore. Her late nights, her secretive behavior, the way she had grown distant and evasive. These were the signs that I couldn't shake, even if I tried to dismiss them, and they gnawed at me with a subtle but insistent urgency. The first time I suspected something wasn't right. It had been a gut feeling, a quiet whisper that I couldn't push away. Lydia had always been open with me, transparent in the way she carried herself, but one evening the change was undeniable. She had come home later than usual, wearing that same smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her phone buzzed on the table as we ate dinner, and she had quickly grabbed it, her movements hurried, her excuse for the call weak. "Just work," she'd said, but something about it felt off. So I started watching, not in a way that was overt or intrusive, but with a quiet attention. Little things at first, small details I hadn't noticed before. How she'd gotten more protective of her phone, keeping it close at all times, hiding it from me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The way she started going out more often, citing reasons that didn't make sense. A sudden girls' night out here, a work dinner there. All the while, her behavior toward me shifted, growing more distant, more guarded. I never wanted to be the paranoid husband, but my instincts were sharp. I had been in relationships long enough to know when something was off, when the comfort and familiarity of someone you loved started to fray at the edges. Then came the texts. They were the undeniable evidence, the proof I had been seeking, even if I hadn't fully been prepared for the weight they carried. I started by checking her phone. An invasion, yes, but one that felt necessary. What I found made my blood run cold. The messages between Lydia and Mark were casual at first, innocent even. But there was a distinct change over time. The tone shifted. The words became more intimate, and I saw the patterns emerge. Late-night texts, exchanged looks, references to times spent together that I hadn't known about. She had been more than just friendly with him. They had become too close. I had seen how she looked at him when they interacted at social gatherings, how her eyes lingered a little too long, how her smile seemed brighter, more genuine with him. It was a look I didn't see when she looked at me. It was as if the warmth of our relationship had faded and been replaced by something else, something she no longer felt with me. But the texts, those were the final nail in the coffin. One morning, when I had gone to the bathroom, I grabbed her phone from the nightstand. I knew it wasn't right, but I had already been consumed by the need to know. I unlocked it and began scrolling through the messages. As I read, I could almost feel my pulse quickening, the tightness in my chest. The messages didn't leave, much to the imagination. They were filled with references to stolen moments, quiet rendezvous, and longing. Mark's messages were filled with affection, with words I had once thought were reserved for me. I can't wait to see you again. I've been thinking about you all day. Don't worry about him. You're mine tonight. And then, the message that sealed everything. I'll be there tomorrow night. Don't tell him. I miss you. The words burned into my brain. I stood there in the dim morning light, clutching the phone, my hands trembling. The sickening feeling in my stomach was immediate, like the ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me unbalanced, unsure of what to do next. But I knew this was the truth I had been avoiding, the truth that had been staring me in the face all along. It wasn't just that she had cheated. It was the calculated nature of it, the secrecy, the manipulation, the way she had played me for a fool. I had seen the signs, had felt the distance, but I had given her the benefit of the doubt. I had been patient, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks. But now there was no denying it. The evidence was right in front of me, raw and undeniable. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, to explode with the anger that had been building inside me. But I knew better than that. No, I wasn't going to let her off that easily. If she thought she could get away with this, if she thought I would just fold like the fool I had been, then she was gravely mistaken. I began to plan, carefully and methodically. If she thought she could lie to me, then I would show her how deep the consequences could go. The first thing I did was gather the evidence. I started keeping a detailed record of the messages, of every interaction between her and Mark, every lie she told me. I didn't confront her yet. I wanted her to think I was oblivious, to give her enough rope to hang herself. I started keeping track of her whereabouts, timing her outings, and watching her excuses unravel. I became a shadow in my own home, unnoticed, yet always present. I knew there was something inside me that had changed. The man I had been, the one who had trusted her with everything, was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone who would make her feel the weight of her choices. The next step was to be patient, to wait for the right moment. I couldn't rush this. If I wanted her to understand the magnitude of her betrayal, I had to make sure she felt every ounce of it, down to the very last detail. And as the days went by, I found myself not just investigating her actions, but studying them. Every glance, every touch, every word. It wasn't just about finding evidence anymore. It was about finding the truth that would burn through the lies and leave nothing behind. The days stretched into an unbearable silence. My mind was consumed with the need for justice. No, not justice, not anymore. It was something deeper, darker, a force that went beyond mere vengeance. I wanted Lydia to feel what I felt, to understand. That betrayal wasn't something easily forgiven. And so I spent those days moving like a ghost, existing in my own home but not truly living in it. The evidence was tucked away, hidden in places where she'd never find it. The messages, the recordings, each one a fragment of the web she had woven, each one a piece of the puzzle I had been trying to solve. But now, it was about more than just uncovering the truth. I wasn't interested in exposing her to the world. I wanted her to face the consequences of her choices in the most intimate way possible. I wanted to break her, not just because she had broken me, but because she had no idea the depth of the pain she had caused. I wanted her to see the extent of her cruelty, the way she had played me, manipulated me into believing that our love was something worth fighting for. And when the time was right, when I was ready to strike, I would make sure she felt every ounce of it. One night, after another of her long business trips that turned out to be nothing more than a cover for her infidelities, I had everything in place. It wasn't just the messages this time. I had gone deeper. I had reached out to people she had confided in, people who had helped her cover her tracks, and from them I gathered more information. Locations, dates, and even pictures of her and Mark together. Images that painted a picture of the betrayal. Each snapshot a reminder of the lie she had been living. She came home that night as she always did, acting like everything was fine. Her face, though tired, held a practiced smile, the kind she had perfected over the years. But I could see the subtle cracks, the tension in her jaw, the nervous flicker in her eyes. She knew something was off. Maybe it was the way I had been, quieter than usual, more distant. But she had no idea how close I was to exposing everything. I didn't say a word as she walked into the living room, placing her purse on the counter and making her way into the kitchen. She moved through the house like she had every right to be there, like I wasn't sitting just feet away from her, calculating the moments until I could make my move. Finally, I broke the silence. "We need to talk." Her movement stilled. She froze for a fraction of a second before turning to face me. "What about?" she asked, her voice too calm, too measured. I stood up slowly, walking toward her with deliberate steps, each one echoing in the space between us. "About your lies, about Mark, about everything." Her eyes widened, her breath hitching in her chest. For a moment, I thought she might try to play innocent again, to try and explain it all away. But I wasn't in the mood for explanations. "I know about the two of you," I continued, my voice cold and even. "I know about your late nights, your secret meetings, the messages, the calls. I know how you've lied to my face for months, and I'm done pretending like I don't see it." She took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her mouth. But I wasn't finished yet. "I've been patient. I've given you every opportunity to come clean, to fix this. But you chose him over me. You chose to deceive me." The words felt like stones in my mouth, heavy, cold, and precise. "And now it's my turn to make a choice." Lydia's face was pale now, her eyes darting around as though searching for a way out, some excuse to turn this around. But I wasn't giving her that. I wasn't giving her the comfort of thinking she could talk her way out of this. "I've already planned everything," I said, my tone sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Tomorrow I'll show you everything you've done. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done, and it won't just be me who sees the truth. You'll lose everything you've built." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes were wide with panic, her entire body trembling. She had always thought she was in control, always thought that she could walk away from this with no consequences. But now, as she stood there before me, she was faced with the reality of what she had done. "I loved you," I continued, the words leaving my mouth almost mechanically. "But you never really loved me, did you? You just loved the idea of me, the convenience of having someone who would trust you, who would believe in you, even when you were breaking them down piece by piece." She opened her mouth again, this time to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her. "Don't bother. I'm done listening to your excuses. Tomorrow, we'll see if you can face the truth." I turned and walked toward the door, my steps deliberate, leaving her standing there in the thick silence that filled the room. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to salvage. The damage was done. The consequences were set in motion, and as I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The storm that had been brewing inside me, the storm of rage and betrayal, had finally found its release. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about taking back control, about making sure that she understood just how deeply her actions had hurt me. And when the truth came out, when the world saw the lie she had lived, I knew it would be a reckoning she could never escape from. The final act of our story had begun. And this time, I would be the one holding the pen. The night before I planned to expose everything, I couldn't sleep. It was as though the anticipation of the upcoming confrontation was keeping me awake, my mind racing through every detail. The evidence I had meticulously collected, the proof of her betrayal, everything I had spent weeks compiling was finally going to be unleashed, and I wondered what it would feel like to see her face when the truth came crashing down. Would she beg for forgiveness? Would she crumble, too broken, to speak? Or would she try to lie her way out of it again, using the same smooth, practiced words she had used so many times before? I didn't know. But what I did know was that nothing would ever be the same again. I spent the early morning hours reviewing everything, texts, photos, even the voice recordings. It was like a dark mirror reflecting back at me the lies she had spun, the trust she had shattered. But each piece, each moment, brought me closer to my goal. I was ready. The next evening, when Lydia walked into the house, I could see the subtle tension in her movements. She was more on edge than I had ever seen her. She moved quickly, almost too quickly, and I noticed the way she kept glancing at me, avoiding eye contact as much as possible. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how much I knew. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my hands folded in front of me. The room felt colder than usual, the air heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. The silence stretched between us as she took her coat off, still not saying anything. I studied her carefully, noticing the small tremors in her hands, the way her breath was shallow. When she finally spoke, it was in that voice, smooth, practiced, trying to maintain control. "What's going on? You've been acting weird all day." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stood up and walked over to the drawer where I had hidden the folder containing everything. As I pulled it out and placed it on the table in front of her, she stiffened. Her eyes flicked down to it, and I could see the color drain from her face as she realized what it was. She opened her mouth to say something, but I silenced her with a single look. I didn't need to hear her excuses anymore. I had all the answers I needed. "You've been lying to me," I said, my voice a low rasp, full of anger that I had spent so long suppressing. "For months now, and I'm done pretending like I didn't know." I watched her face as she took in the sight of the folder, her eyes darting back and forth, her breathing becoming more erratic. She could no longer hide behind her charm, her carefully constructed web of lies. I had laid it all bare for her to see. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached for the folder and flipped it open. The first thing she saw was the picture of her and Mark together, an image that had been taken from a distance, but enough to reveal their closeness. Her hand froze on the page as she stared at it, her lips parting in shock. "This is a mistake," she stammered, her voice shaking. This isn't what you think." I felt a surge of disgust ripple through me at the sound of her voice, at the same tired excuses I had heard so many times before. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers, making sure she could see the depth of my anger. "No, this is exactly what I think," I said, each word deliberate, heavy with the weight of truth. "The late nights, the secret meetings, the lies you told me, Lydia, it all adds up. And this," I gestured to the evidence in front of her, "this is the final proof that you've been seeing him behind my back." Her eyes filled with panic as she looked from the pictures to the texts I had printed out. Texts that were filled with sweet nothings, affectionate words meant for someone else, someone who wasn't me. Her gaze flickered nervously, and I could see the walls she had built around herself start to crumble. I can't explain," she stuttered, her voice faltering, but I could hear the desperation creeping in. She was trying to regain control, trying to manipulate the situation as she always did, but it wasn't working anymore. "No, you can't," I said coldly. "You can't explain away months of deceit. You can't explain away the fact that you lied to my face, that you pretended everything was fine while you were sneaking around with him." She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and she started pacing back and forth, her hands wringing together in anxiety. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but it just happened. It was just one night. One mistake." The words felt like poison in the air, and I couldn't stop the sneer that tugged at my lips. One mistake. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a betrayal that had been brewing for months, a betrayal that had shattered everything I believed in. She didn't get to hide behind excuses anymore. "No," I replied, my voice low and controlled. "This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. You made a choice every time you went behind my back, every time you lied to me." Her eyes welled with tears now, and she took a step toward me, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this, please. I love you. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far." I didn't move. I didn't want to be swayed by her tears or her desperate apologies. She had already made her choice. It was too late for apologies now. "I'm done," I said, my voice firm, steady. "You're going to have to live with the consequences of your actions, just like I had to live with the lies you told me." She stood there, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling as if the weight of everything finally crashed down on her. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. This wasn't about healing. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the bitter taste of revenge, the satisfaction of knowing that she couldn't hide anymore. I turned away from her then, walking toward the door. But before I left, I gave her one last look. "I'll make sure everyone knows. I'll make sure you face the consequences. You won't get away with this, Lydia. Not this time."